Hello and welcome back to History for Atheists. Here's a story you might have heard. Once upon a time there was a vast repository of knowledge called the Great Library of Alexandria. It was the greatest centre of learning and scholarship in the ancient world, and many of the best minds of the time studied there. It held as many as 700,000 books, and its scholars greatly advanced science and technology through their many remarkable discoveries. Well, one day a mob of Christians descended on the Great Library, determined to destroy it. They hated learning, scholarship and science, and so they attacked the library, stripped the shelves of their books and burned them all. This was a terrible blow for the progression of human knowledge. Vast amounts of advanced information were lost forever in this great cataclysm, and the Western world was plunged into a dark age. Human development was set back by at least 1,000 years by this one act, and if the Christians had not destroyed the Great Library, technology would be far more advanced than it is now. Of course, this is a great story. It's a stark morality tale with a clear message about the value of books, learning and science, and the dangers of fundamentalist religion and its hatred of scholarship. The only problem is this story is complete fantasy. It never happened. This doesn't stop many of my fellow atheists from retelling this fairy tale and getting very angry about this event that never actually took place. In January 2014, someone posted this meme to the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science page on Facebook. It's one that pops up on history sites often, but when it was posted to the Dawkins group, its members showed what history fans they really were, with comments slamming those wicked Christians for destroying the Great Library. I still hate the church for doing that. I mean, where else could you just hop off the main road and go to college? That place was an intellectual's haven. I get upset by the fact that the loss of all this knowledge and wisdom was at human hands, not some accidental cause. Ignorance destroys enlightenment just because of its own stupidity. It reinforces my hatred for religious zealots and distaste for religion in general. How much greater would our advancements be now if it were not for ridiculous acts and events such as this? That last example also includes a theme found in many other comments, that this alleged Christian destruction set back the natural course of the advancement of knowledge and technological progress. Think how entirely different the human world ever since would have been. Entire fields of human endeavour following other paths: medicine, agriculture, transportation, architecture, education itself, a virtual alternative universe. If religious barbarians hadn't destroyed the Library of Alexandria, we'd probably have colonies on Mars and the Jovian moons by now. Probably the single greatest loss to general knowledge, science, engineering, etc. in history. Even Hitler's book burning pales by comparison. Science was set back 200 years at least. As an example, remember the Romans had complex central heating 2,000 years ago, not widely seen again until the 20th century. And if all that isn't enough, no further bad history surrounding the Great Library would be complete without linking it to another atheist fable, the murder of Hypatia of Alexandria on account of her learning and rationality. We would have had a colony on Mars and cured all diseases if the mob didn't burn down the library and tore the flesh off the bones of Hypatia, the great woman that was the head of the library at the time. So where are these people getting all this stuff that makes them so very angry? Unfortunately, this is another case where the average new atheist's grasp of history has been informed not by a historian, but by a scientist, and where the scientist has, yet again, got pretty much everything wrong. The main culprit here, unfortunately, is the late Carl Sagan. I must admit that, like many of my generation, I have a soft spot for Sagan. He was an excellent public educator and something of a showman, and he could bring the wonder of science to a broader audience in ways that many of his colleagues simply couldn't. It was his 1980 TV series, Cosmos, A Personal Voyage, that made him a household name. It became the most widely watched public access television series of the 1980s and virtually single-handedly established a new kind of public science education. Sagan took a wide-ranging theme of the history of the cosmos and how we humans have come to understand it using science and reason. It was the way he used the history of science to explain scientific concepts that intrigued me as a teenager, though I was later to learn that Sagan was a much better scientist and presenter than he was a historian. Sagan wrote his series and its accompanying best-selling book in 1978 to 1979, in the shadow of the Cold War, the era of apartheid, and the wake of the Iranian Revolution and years of radical terrorism. The final episode of the series, Who Speaks for the Earth, was a reflection on the future of humanity and a plea for sanity in the face of increasing threats to our civilization. It's in this context that Sagan tells a moral fable about the Great Library of Alexandria and its fall to the forces of irrationality and superstition. The story that Sagan tells is a fine one, and the morals he draws from it are admirable, but as a historical account, it's absolutely terrible. He makes a number of dubious claims, presents speculation as fact, and makes several flat-out factual errors. While he also makes the weird claim that Greco-Roman civilization collapsed because of slavery, it's the 19th century cliches about the Dark Ages that were finally relieved by the glorious Renaissance that form the basis of his depiction of Western intellectual history. In a strange inversion of the actual chronology, somehow Sagan puts the murder of Hypatia of Alexandria before the abject surrender to mysticism, which he says led to the mob that came to burn the Great Library down. The influence of his account of the murder of Hypatia is a topic for a future episode here, and my article on those myths can be found on the History for Atheists website. But it's his heartfelt ode to the Great Library, his allusions to the advances it could have inspired if it had survived, followed by his condemnation of the forces of stagnation, pessimism and mysticism, which caused this jewel to be burned down, that continue to inspire anger in many people. Most of the expressions of outrage and hatred against the religious barbarians outlined earlier draw directly or indirectly on Sagan's account. Of course, Sagan did not invent the tale of a Christian mob burning down the Great Library. In fact, to be fair, he really only alludes to it indirectly. Like many of these positivist fables, the origin of the story seems to lie in the polemics of the 18th century. In this case, the main perpetrator is our old friend, Edward Gibbon. The valuable library of Alexandria was pillaged or destroyed, and near 20 years afterwards, the appearance of the empty shelves excited the regret and indignation of every spectator whose mind was not totally darkened by religious prejudice. The compositions of ancient genius, so many of which have irretrievably perished, might surely have been accepted from the wreck of idolatry for the amusement and instruction of succeeding ages. Writing between 1776 and 1778, Gibbon was working well before any later ideas about historians being judicious and objective. Like Voltaire and the French philosophes who influenced him, Gibbon had several large ideological axes to grind, and one of them was anti-Christian. His book shows a strong reaction to the Catholicism he briefly flirted with as a student, and while his anti-Christian polemic won him enemies and angry condemnation from English churchmen on its publication, the fact that most of his wry criticism was seen as aimed at the Church of Rome meant that it was largely acceptable to much of his audience. His Decline and Fall became a bestseller, and for all its many historiographical faults, is still rightly regarded as an English literary masterpiece. Since it was the most read book on the subject of the fall of Rome for several centuries, it unfortunately also remains highly influential on popular conceptions of that subject. Sagan was drawing on Gibbon's tradition in his hymn to the Great Library, which means the new atheists are getting their ideas on the subject third or fourth hand from sources that are dubious, patently biased, and totally outdated. Most modern accounts say the Great Library of Alexandria was founded at the beginning of the 3rd century BC, when Demetrius of Phalerum, a former student of Theophrastos, who in turn was a student and successor of Aristotle, went into exile in the then fledgling city of Alexandria and proposed a plan for the library to King Ptolemy I Soter. This is a neat story that makes a direct link between the peripatetic school of Aristotle and the founding of the library, and establishes it as being modelled on Aristotle's Lyceum in Athens. Unfortunately, the story is a little bit too neat and is actually cobbled together from some fragments of information that could just as easily be read in other ways. There is certainly an account from a century later which attributes the founding of the library to Demetrius in Ptolemy I's reign, but there are good reasons to be suspicious of its accuracy. Other sources mention Demetrius in relation to the foundation of the library, but do so in reference to Ptolemy's successor, Ptolemy II Philadelphos. So we don't know exactly who founded the library, and we aren't absolutely clear on precisely when. What is clear is that it was quite early in the history of what was to become the great city of Alexandria, and that its establishment made the city a centre of learning for many centuries to come. What should also be understood, however, is that it was not actually a library that was established at all. The great library that we refer to was a collection of books associated with a religious shrine, the Museion in Greek, or museum in Latin. This institution was, as the name implies, dedicated to the 9 muses. The temple to the muses had a priest appointed by the Ptolemaic kings and was the centre of a complex that included an exedra or hall with recesses and seats for lectures and private study. According to the only and rather brief surviving description given by Strabo in the early 1st century AD, it also included a communal dining hall with kitchens, a dormitory and other residential apartments, extensive gardens decorated with statues, and a shaded walk, probably useful in Egypt. What we call the Great Library was a collection of books gathered to service the scholars who were housed in and worked in the Museion, and it was stored partly in the complex itself and later on other sites, including at least 3 daughter libraries. The popular image of the Great Library as an echoing hall lined with shelves of scrolls and desks and tables for scholars is almost certainly inaccurate. That kind of library, which is still the model for many traditional styled libraries today, was developed much later by the Romans, and the museum would instead have had, as historian Lionel Casson describes it, a colonnade with a line-up of rooms behind. The rooms would serve for shelving the holdings, and the colonnade provides space for the readers. The idea that anyone could just wander into the museum and use the Great Library is also a complete fantasy. It was a private institution and actually part of the royal palace complex. Anyone who tried to get into it without permission would be unceremoniously dispatched back to the street by the royal guard. The smaller daughter libraries in other parts of the city, on the other hand, do seem to have been open to the public, or at least somewhat more accessible. The museum in Alexandria was far from the only shrine to the muses in the ancient world, nor was it the only one that had an associated centre of study. Pythagoras had recommended the establishment of a shrine to the muses for the promotion of learning on his first arrival in Croton, for example, and the Seleucid kings had built one at Antioch in the late 2nd century BC, with an attended centre for study and a library. The fact that the Great Library was actually associated with a religious shrine is something that's ignored or glossed over in many modern accounts. Sagan, in the sequencing in Cosmos mentioned earlier, talks about how one of the daughter libraries was the Serapeum, which was the temple of Serapis, but he skips around this in a rather gingerly manner. He says that the Serapeum was once a temple, but was later reconsecrated to knowledge. This is complete nonsense. The Serapeum was always a temple and was not reconsecrated to anything. Libraries were often established as adjuncts to temples, but it seems Sagan was attempting to distance the annex of the Great Library from the temple in which it sat, because this didn't quite fit with his theme of secular knowledge's superiority to mysticism. Like the Serapeum, the museum was a temple with a research institution and a book collection associated with it. That aside, the museum really was primarily a research institution, and its associated book collection, which I'll continue to refer to by the shorthand expression the Great Library, was clearly one of, if not the most extensive, in the ancient world. Many famous ancient scholars worked in the museum, including Eratosthenes and probably Ptolemy, but several who are often claimed as working there, or even as being librarians of the Great Library no less, clearly did not. Sagan's hymn of praise says that Hipparchus studied there, but he seems to have only used some of the books from the collection, and there's no evidence he ever even visited from his home on Rhodes. Likewise, Sagan says Archimedes worked there, but there's no clear evidence for this, and what little we know of Archimedes' life indicates that he spent it entirely in Syracuse. Of the others Sagan mentions, Euclid and Herophilos may have studied there, depending on when the museum was established, and Dionysius of Thrace is another maybe, though more likely. On the whole, Sagan's roll call of great scholars is mainly hyperbole and speculation rather than historical fact. The other figure who is regularly invoked as being associated with the Great Library and even presented as its last librarian is, again, Hypatia. This is despite the fact that both the Great Library and its daughter library in the Serapeum had ceased to exist by her time. So we can say that the Great Library was an extensive collection of books associated with the famous Institute of Learning and Research that was the Shrine of the Muses in Alexandria. That much is clear. But many of the other things often claimed about it are much less clear, and some of them are pure fantasy. So it's time to turn to the list of things that the Great Library was not. It was the largest library in the ancient world, containing over 700,000 books. Well, it's entirely possible that it was the largest library in the ancient world, though we have no way of confirming this, given that we have very little reliable information about the size of its collection. Despite this, popular sources regularly repeat the huge figures given for the number of books in the library, which can be found in several of our ancient sources, and usually opt for the ones that go for the highest number. Shakespeare scholar Stephen Greenblatt's popular history, The Swerve, How the Renaissance Began, won critical acclaim and even garnered him a Pulitzer Prize, despite being panned by actual historians for its many howlers and weirdly old-fashioned historiography. Greenblatt's account sticks closely to the 19th century narrative of the Dark Ages, beloved by new atheists, so it's hardly surprising that the myths about the Great Library figure prominently in his account. Thus he informs his readers with great assurance that, at its height, the museum contained at least 500,000 papyrus rolls, systematically organised, labelled and shelved according to a clever new system, alphabetical order. The figure of 500,000 scrolls, or even 500,000 books, is the one that is usually bandied about, but even that colossal number is not quite enough for some polemicists. Attorney and columnist Jonathan Kirsch plumped for a much higher number in his book God Against the Gods, The History of the War Between Monotheism and Polytheism. He writes, in 390 AD, a mob of Christian zealots attacked the ancient library of Alexandria, a place where the works of the greatest rarity and antiquity had been collected, some 700 volumes and scrolls in all. Obviously, the larger the collection in the Great Library, the more terrible the tragedy of its loss. So those seeking to apportion blame for the supposed destruction of the library usually go for these much higher numbers. But did the Great Library really contain this huge number of books, given that these numbers would represent a large library collection even today? As with most things on this subject, it seems that the answer is no. The first problem relevant here is that the sources vary widely in the figures that they give for the number of scrolls in the library. Some of these figures are interdependent, so for example Ammianus is probably depending directly or indirectly on Aulus Gellius for his 700,000 figure, which in turn is where Kirsch gets the same number. Others look suspiciously precise, such as Epiphanius's 54,800. In summary of a lot of discussion by critical scholars, the best thing that we can say is that none of these figures is reliable. In her survey of the historiography of the issue, Diana Delia notes, lacking modern inventory systems, ancient librarians, even if they cared to, scarcely have the time or the means to count their collections. Or as another historian once put it wryly, there are no statistics in ancient sources, just rhetorical flourishes made with numbers. One way that historians can make estimates of the size of ancient libraries is by examining the floor plans of their ruins and calculating the space their book niches would have taken up around the walls and then the number of scrolls each niche could hold. This works for some other ancient libraries for which we have surveyable remains, but unfortunately this is not the case for the museum, given that archaeologists still have to guess exactly where it stood. So Columbia University's Roger S. Bagnall has taken another tack. In a 2002 paper that debunks several of the myths about the Great Library, he begins with how many authors we know were writing in the early Hellenistic period. He notes that we know of around 450 authors for whom we have at the very least some lines of writing whose work existed in the 4th century BC, and another 175 from the 3rd century BC. He points out that most of these writers probably only wrote works that filled a couple of scrolls at most, though a small number of them, like the playwrights, would have had a total corpus that filled many more than that, even up to 100 scrolls. So by adopting the almost certainly far too high figure of an average of 50 scrolls to contain the work of each writer, Bagnall arrives at a mere 31,250 scrolls to contain all the works of all the writers we know about to the end of the 3rd century. He notes, "We must then assume, to save the ancient figures for the contents of the library, either that more than 90% of classical authors are not even quoted or cited in what survives, or that the Ptolemies acquired a dozen copies of everything, or some combination of these unlikely hypotheses. If we were more plausibly to use a lower average of output per author, the hypotheses needed to save the numbers would become proportionally more outlandish." Bagnall makes other calculations taking into account guesses at what number of completely lost authors there may have been, and still doesn't manage to get close to most of the figures given in our sources. His analysis makes it fairly clear that these numbers, presented so uncritically by popular modern authors for rhetorical effect, are probably fantasies. As mentioned above, when we can survey the archaeology of an ancient library's ruins, some estimate can be made of its holdings. The library in the Forum of Trajan in Rome occupied a large space, 27 by 20 metres, and Lionel Casson estimates it could have held in the neighbourhood of 20,000 scrolls. A similar survey of the remains of the Great Library of Pergamon comes to a similar estimate of 30,000 scrolls there. Given that this library was considered a genuine rival to the Great Library of Alexandria, it is most likely that the latter held around maybe 40 to 50,000 scrolls at its height, containing a smaller number of works overall, given that ancient works usually took up more than one scroll. This still seems to have made it the greatest library collection in the ancient world, and thus the source of its renown and its later myths, but it's a far cry from the 500,000 or 700,000 claimed by uncritical popular sources and by people with axes to grind. It was unique, and it contained all the wisdom of the ancient world. One of the odder elements in the new atheist myths about the Great Library is the strange idea that its supposed destruction somehow single-handedly wiped out the alleged advanced scientific knowledge of the ancient world in one terrible cataclysm. It doesn't take much thought, however, to realise that this makes absolutely no sense. The idea that there was just one library in the whole of the ancient world is clearly absurd, and as my mentions of other rival libraries earlier make clear, there were of course hundreds of libraries, great and small, across the ancient Mediterranean. Libraries and the communities of scholars and scribes that serviced them were established by rulers and civic worthies as the kind of prestige project that was seen as part of their role in ancient society and marked their city or their territory as cultured and civilized. The Ptolemies were not the only successors to Alexander, who built a museum with a library. Their Seleucid rivals in Syria also built one in Antioch, as I mentioned earlier, in the reigns of Antiochus IV Eusebius, or maybe Antiochus X Philopator. Roman aristocrats and rulers also included the establishment of substantial libraries as part of their civic service. Julius Caesar had intended to establish a library next to the Forum in Rome, but this ultimately was achieved after his death by Gaius Asinius Pollio, a soldier, politician and scholar who retired to a life of study after the tumults of the civil wars. Augustus established the Palatine Library in the Temple of Apollo and founded another one in the Portus Octaviae next to the Theatre of Marcellus. Vespasian established one in the Temple of Peace in 70 AD, but probably the largest of the Roman libraries was that of Trajan I mentioned earlier, established in his new forum beside the famous column that celebrates his Dacian wars. As mentioned earlier, this large building probably contained around 20,000 scrolls and had two main chambers, one for Greek and the other for Latin authors. Trajan's library, interestingly, seems to have established a design and layout that would be the model for libraries for centuries, a hall with desks and tables for readers, with books in niches or shelves around the walls and on a mezzanine level. Libraries also came to be established in many Roman bath complexes, with a very large one at the baths of Caracalla and another one in the baths of Diocletian. Several of these libraries were substantial. The library of Celsus at Ephesus was built around 117 AD by the son of Tiberius Celsus Ptolemais in honour of his father, who had been a senator and consul in Rome, and its reconstructed facade is one of the major archaeological features of that site today. It was said to be the third largest in the world, surpassed only by the great libraries of Pergamon and that, of course, of Alexandria. The Great Library of Pergamon was established by the Attalid rulers of that city-state, and it was the true rival of the Library of the Alexandrian Museum. It is said that the Ptolemies were so threatened by its size and the reputation of their scholars that they banned the export of papyrus to Pergamon, causing the Attalids to commission the invention of parchment as a substitute, though this is most likely a legend. What is absolutely clear, however, is that the idea that the Great Library of Alexandria was unique, whether in nature or even in size, is absolute nonsense. The weird idea that the loss of the Great Library was some kind of singular disaster is at least partially due to the fact that none of the various other great libraries of the ancient world are known to casual readers, so it may be easy for them to assume that it was somehow the only one of its kind. It also seems to stem again from the emphasis in popular sources on the mythical immense size of its collection, which, as we've just discussed, is based on a naive acceptance of varied and wildly exaggerated sources. Finally, it stems in no small part from, yet again, Sagan's influential but completely fanciful picture of the institution as a distinctively secular hub of scientific research and, by implication, technological innovation. It was a centre for the study of science, and its loss set back technology by 1,000 years. Sagan's roll call of Greek scientists who he claims worked at the Great Library makes it sound like some kind of ancient Mediterranean MIT. Eratosthenes, Hipparchus, Euclid, Dionysius of Thrace, Herophilus, Archimedes, Ptolemy, and so on. Unfortunately, only one of these people, Eratosthenes, can definitely be said to be associated with the Great Library. Two others from Sagan's list, Dionysius and Ptolemy, may have been. And once you take out all the others, that really only leaves Eratosthenes and maybe Conon of Samos and much later Ptolemy as scholars of the Great Library who did anything like what we would call science. We can perhaps shoehorn in Euclid and the physicians and anatomists Herophilos and Erasistratos, depending on when the museum was established, but overall the evidence for the institution as some great centre of scientific research is actually rather thin, which means it's perhaps less surprising to learn on examining the sources that the Great Library was actually celebrated mainly for a specialisation which is about as far from modern science as possible, the study of poetry. This makes some sense given that the museum was dedicated to the Muses, four of whom represented forms of verse. The works of Homer in particular were a primary focus of study across the Greek world, and his poems permeated thought, writing, and everyday speech rather like the works of Shakespeare do today. It was the scholars of the Museon who, on gathering and comparing copies of the Iliad and the Odyssey from across the Greek-speaking world, noticed textual differences, large and small, and established the kind of textual analysis that's still used by editors to this day, working to determine the best possible text from manuscript variants. Other works of Greek poetry, such as the Odes of Pindar, were also analysed and studied in a similar way, as were the works of the great Athenian playwrights. The importance of literary studies at the museum can be seen by analysing the specialisations of the men that we do know were directors of the institution, and therefore librarians of the Great Library. Again, of these scholars, only Eratosthenes is known for doing anything that we would consider to be science. The others were largely devoted to literary and textual analysis of poetry and grammar. Of course, all these scholars were polymaths, so most of them would have probably ranged over many topics, including areas of mathematics and natural philosophy. Eratosthenes himself was nicknamed Beta because he covered so many disciplines that he was something of a jack of all trades and master of none of them, so his colleagues mocked him as number two in all subjects. Academics could be vicious about their colleagues even back then. That aside, the idea that the museum was a major centre of scientific speculation is at best an exaggeration and largely yet another fantasy. And it's even more of a fantasy that it was a centre of technological innovation. Many of the lamentations from the Dawkins group on Facebook quoted earlier rhapsodise about the great technical discoveries that could have been made had the Great Library somehow evaded its alleged fiery demise at the hands of Christians. This is a consistent theme in new atheist discussions that mention the Great Library or the supposed impact of Christianity on progress, with the idea being that the scientific and industrial revolutions were due on some kind of inevitable deterministic historical timetable, but were wantonly derailed for 1,000 years by the destruction of the Great Library, which is supposedly why we don't live on the moons of Jupiter, apparently. The problem with all this is not just that the scholars at the museum were rather more interested in textual variants of Pindar's Paeanies than studying physics, but also a common modern misunderstanding about the nature of Greek science. Many modern people, including modern scientists, hear about the Greeks discussing motion or atoms, or doing geometry to measure the circumference of the Earth or the distance to the Sun, and assume that they were doing science in the modern sense of the word. Historians also sometimes refer to Greek natural philosophy as science, as a kind of a shorthand, and popularisations of the history of science draw simplistic direct lines between things like Greek discussions of atoms and modern atomic theory. But this obscures the fact that Greek proto-science was, while a distant linear ancestor of modern sciences, very unlike them in many important respects. At best, it was a highly rational attempt at understanding fundamental precepts of the physical and natural world, but it used induction and common sense far more than it used measurement and experiment. There are exceptions, mainly in geometry and its related field astronomy, but the Greeks were usually not very interested in empirical measurement, and so were even less interested in genuine experiments. Most Greek proto-science was a highly abstract and rather philosophical affair based on some observations, but without modern ideas of carefully designed and repeatable experiments with calibrated measurement and its attendant mathematics. Most of their science was done by sitting around thinking and talking about concepts, not by actually dropping weights from towers, though they did do thought experiments which sometimes led to correct conclusions and sometimes didn't. Their science was not our science, and this needs to be remembered. This means that a Greek conversation about atoms was largely an abstract and rather metaphysical exercise about the philosophical nature of a thing and how many times it could be divided conceptually, and what this may mean. The word comes from the Greek atomos, meaning unhewn, uncut, indivisible. No Greek philosopher walked away from such a conversation and decided to try and build some equipment to explore the physical nature of atomic structure, and would probably have considered such an idea to be absurd. Nor would they have taken the step of considering that different forms of matter, liquid or gas, were made of different combinations of atoms, and so decide to experiment with these substances to understand this better. All Greek proto-science was actually part of a wider philosophical quest to find the best way to live in the world, which included natural philosophy, or the exploration of the nature of that world. But this exploration was always subsumed in a set of broader philosophical and metaphysical assumptions, many of which we would regard as completely wrong and even rather bizarre. The nature of Greek thought did allow them to draw useful and often correct conclusions about the physical universe, but it also set up barriers to the true scientific method that they simply did not and could not cross. This was one of the reasons there was rarely any direct link between their proto-scientific science and technology. Natural philosophy was, as the term would suggest, the preserve of philosophers. In a world where most of the population had to be devoted to agricultural production and where most of the rest barely got by, sitting around and talking about abstractions like atoms was a rich man's luxury. Most philosophers either came from the upper class, though maybe the lower echelons in many cases, or had rich patrons, or both, which meant most philosophers had little interest in making or inventing things. That was generally the preserve of lowly mechanics who were mostly slaves. Again, there were exceptions to this. Archimedes seems to have had some interest in the engineering applications of his ideas, even if most of the inventions attributed to him are probably legends. And some geometry was also put to practical use, such as calibrating the use of siege artillery. On the whole, however, lofty Greek philosophers didn't think to soil their hands with something as lowly as inventing and making things. So the largely unempirical and abstract nature of Greek natural philosophy, and the fact that it was generally socially divorced from the practical arts of engineering and architecture, meant that most Greek and Roman scientists did little to advance technology, and the idea that the Great Library would have been filled with men excitedly sketching flying machines or submarines is once again a fantasy. When all this is pointed out, some new atheists try to invoke counter-evidence. They often claim, for example, Hero of Alexandria worked at the Great Library and he invented the steam engine. Even a scientist who has not studied much history past high school, in other words, most of them, have some dim memories of the history of the Industrial Revolution and would therefore know it had something to do with the invention of steam engines. So surely Hero brought the ancient world to the brink of an industrial transformation. Well, actually, no. Hero does seem to have been another exception to the rule when it comes to philosophers tinkering with gadgets, and it's possible, though far from certain, that he worked in the museum. But the practical applications of his study of pneumatics and dynamics were more toys and curiosities than any great leaps forward in technology. He famously made an Aeolipile, though he didn't actually invent it, given that it had already been described by the Roman engineer and architect Vitruvius. But this can only be called a steam engine in the loosest sense of that term. Hero's little device was not capable of doing anything more than just sitting and spinning in place, and Roman technology lacked the high tensile metallurgy, the mathematics, or the precision tooling that would be required to make a true steam engine that could do real work. The other technological wonder that is often invoked here is the Antikythera mechanism. Exactly how this intricate mechanical ori, based on a geocentric model, is supposed to indicate some nascent industrial or scientific revolution is never made clear, but not only did it have no connection to the Great Library, it was a kind of instrument known since the 3rd century BC. If it's evidence that the Greco-Roman world was on the brink of a technological revolution, and this was only stymied by the rise of Christianity, one has to wonder what kept them from achieving this wondrous thing for the 600 years between its invention and the conversion of Constantine. The new atheist mythic conception of the Great Library of Alexandria bears very little resemblance to any historical actuality. It was a shrine with scholars attached to it, not a secular university. Its scholars were far more concerned with poetry, textual analysis, grammar, lexicography and rhetoric than anything we would see as science. The proto-science they did do was mainly of a highly abstract and often metaphysical nature rather than anything like modern science. And it was also generally divorced from technical innovation, and what little practical application it was given did not do much at all to advance technology. The idea that if the Great Library had not been burned down by wicked Christians, we'd all be living in gleaming space cities on Europa or Callisto is therefore a silly fantasy, and not least because the Great Library wasn't burned down by wicked Christians. But the story of how the Great Library actually came to an end and where the myth of it being burned by Christians came from, we'll have to wait until the next part of this episode. Until then, see you again here soon.